I'm Kevin Clayton, professor of history at Tulsa Community College, and I'm joined today by Randy Krehbiel, the author of Tulsa, 1921, Reporting a Massacre, and Randy is also with the Tulsa World. Welcome, Randy.
Thank you.
Glad to have you.
Glad to be here.
The first thing I want to do is thank you for writing the book. It was very informative and very timely, and I want to also let you know that it will be used here at the college in several classes in the spring semester. So
thank you very much.
Very timely, very informative work, and I enjoyed reading it.
Thank you.
I want to ask you first about the title, the cover page of the book, the picture that you chose for the cover. Who's the gentleman in the picture, and what's going on there?
Well, we were looking for something that reflects the devastation of those 2 days. Really, the devastation of the morning of June the 1st, 1921, because that's when really Greenwood was destroyed. And I actually had initially chosen a photograph that had no one in it. It was just the, ruins. And one of the editors suggested that one. And the man in the picture is my understanding, my belief is that was a photographer, a black man who was a photographer, and that he was looking at his business, what was left of his business. And if you look real closely, he appears to be holding a camera. So he may, and I cannot remember his name, but that's who he was. He was a photographer, and maybe the only commercial photographer in Greenwood. I'm not sure. Okay,
it certainly captures. It's a gripping photo that really
it's
captures
devastation and desolation, because you've got the just the ruins, but then you have the man standing there looking at all that's left of his, I guess you would say, material life.
Sure, absolutely. You use the word massacre, reporting a massacre. That word is relatively new in the description of what happened. For a very long time, it was described as the Tulsa Race Riot.
Yes.
Why did you choose massacre, and what did you want to convey by choosing that word?
Well, you are correct. It was generally called a massacre, or generally called a riot, but it was also called other things until very recently, like within the last 5 years. And so we had some people who felt like it ought to be called a massacre, and there are various reasons for that, or various arguments for that. And I guess for me, it was just kind of a matter of, well, I guess if I was standing at Greenwood and Archer on the morning of June 1st, 1921, it would look like a massacre to me.
Sure.
But there's a lot that has gone into that. I think some of it is, there's a certain power or control in being able to put a name to something. And so it gave people a sense that they get to choose the name. And then there's another aspect of it, which is that because it was a riot, considered a riot, the people could not collect from their insurance. Or successfully file tort claims against the city and all that. I'm not sure that changing the name now will alter that, but I think for some people there's an importance to it that way too.
I teach African American history, and I spend some time talking to my students about the terminology. And so when you use the word riot, you're describing a group of people who engage in an uprising and commit acts of violence and vandalism and the like, but that's certainly not what happened.
Yeah, and it's an interesting thing about the use of the word riot. At the time that it occurred, riots were more commonly associated with white people going, in this case, in the United States, going into, say, black neighborhoods and destroying things. And then later, probably certainly in the 60s, when we had different kinds of events, Detroit, Watts, those
Right.
people were rioting and in a lot of cases burning and destroying their own neighborhoods. They were different kinds of, and I think some people feel like riot came to be associated with that kind of activity rather than the meaning that it had in 1921, which was, or one of the meanings it had in 1921, which was people going into a neighborhood and destroying it. So,
So it sounds like you using the definition from the time for riot, think that is
well, I mean, I think it, so
to a certain extent
I've heard
accurate,
people, so I heard someone one time say there really is no one single word that
captures
captures
sure.
it. And I think I agree with that. But I don't, if somebody wants to call it a riot, I don't have a big problem with that. If somebody wants to call it a massacre, I don't have a problem with that.
Okay.
Mary Parrish called it a disaster, and that's pretty all-encompassing, but that doesn't completely cover it all either. So there was all sorts of, I mean, at the very outset, you could make a pretty good argument that it really was a riot because it was just people going through downtown Tulsa sort of randomly shooting and things like that. But by the time they got to the actual destruction of Greenwood, it was something different.
And the title of the book, again, is Tulsa, 1921. And you do a very good job of describing the racial climate in Tulsa at that time. And could you talk a little bit about the context, the social context for what happened?
Yeah, you know, I think this period in American history is often sort of overlooked or glossed over. I'm talking about the period from, say, 1877 to the end of Reconstruction up until really after World War II in terms of race relations. Because I think a lot of people, and especially a lot of white people, think, you know, we had the Civil War, the slaves were freed, everything was better, and then, you know, 100 years later, they got a little bit better. But actually things were very difficult in that period, especially for African Americans. And, you know, in many places they couldn't vote. In many places they lived in a condition of, well, it was known as virtual peonage. In other words, they were not considered slaves, but they weren't really free either. They were sharecroppers and tenant farmers in many cases who had very little freedom to move about because they were tied down with debt and things like that. And so in Tulsa in 1921, you had a situation with a relatively prosperous community that had achieved an element of independence.
The wealthiest black community in the nation.
And that's what many people say, and I don't dispute that. I don't know how you prove it, but certainly there seems to have been a very strong middle class for sure, and you had businesses that were not directly reliant on the white majority. In other words, you know, you had these merchants who dealt mainly with African Americans, and they kept their money in the community, and that spread it around and made it last longer. It does not appear that there was a big effort made to keep African Americans, or at least the ones who lived in the city, pretty much permanently from voting. So there was an active political life as well, and we don't know a whole lot about it, but there are some indications of it. So that was going on, and then, you know, you had the war, the Great War, World War I, and some number of black veterans had come back from
Sure.
the war, and we fought to make the world safe for democracy.
Right.
And they're being
No democracy,
discriminated.
right.
They're being discriminated against.
In fact, you talk about that, and I want to have you elaborate a little bit on that. You talk about the post-World War I racial climate in the nation, and the violence that swept the nation after after the First World War, beginning with Red Summer, and the summer and fall of 1919, as the background for what happened here in Tulsa. And you seem to suggest that what happened here was sort of a continuation of, or very similar to, certainly, what had been going on in the nation in the years immediately preceding.
So to me, what it seems like is that each of these dozens of incidents that had occurred across the country from really, well, you can almost name the date, but for sure from 1919, 1920, really on up to about 1923, so each one of them was unique in their own way, but they had a common element, which was African Americans trying to break out of the bonds that were on them. These were in some cases legal and sometimes social, but you were really constrained in terms of what you could do for an occupation. How much money you could make, where you could go, what kind of occupations you
Sure. Legalized segregation.
Yes,
in many parts of the country.
Yeah, and so all of that was going on, and I think there was you had the beginnings of the NAACP, and one of their first important cases was involved Oklahoma. It was the Gwynn case, and then there were some other groups that were somewhat more. I don't know if you want to call them radical, but at least they were demanding more change.
You talk about the New Negro movement.
Yeah, right.
That's something that I go over in my African American history class, that we cover in my African American history class, the effort of African Americans to obtain civil rights, but also to push back against the racist stereotypes and images of African Americans as unintelligent, and incapable of contributing to American democracy. So at the same time, we have that movement in the United States and gaining popularity during this same period.
Yeah, so you've got all of those things coming on, and I would say I think economic equality was also very big. I mean, so a lot of what I did, as you know from reading the book, was I started out just reading the newspapers, and this gave me some information about the massacre, but it also gave me a lot of information just about the community, and I came to understand that there was this duality in that there were a lot of people who considered themselves somewhat sympathetic or at least beneficial towards African Americans, who were nevertheless pretty staunch segregationists, and they wanted to believe in the idea that you could have legal equality. In other words, we could preserve your property rights, or if someone committed a crime against you, we would take them to court. That would be equal, but that social equality was just unthinkable. We can't have that. And that's one of the things that it seems to me is just that you just can't. That just isn't going to work. You can't have that because
right.
Again, most of the things that happen in the world, most of the conflicts in the world, whether it's over who gets the TV remote or who gets the White House, it's about money and power and control and who sets the agenda. It's about who gets to name things. It's about who gets what. And we still had in place this kind of social and economic system that depended on African Americans, and in some places in the country, other Asians and others, but we're talking about Tulsa, African Americans to be willing to occupy a certain socioeconomic niche that was very restricted.
Sure, absolutely. So you focus on the role of Tulsa's two main newspapers, the World and the Tribune, in creating both creating the climate and also in reporting on events. So tell us about those two newspapers at the time, a little bit about them and their role in what happened.
The Tulsa World was published by a man named Eugene Lorton. It had been started in 1905 as a Republican organ during the build-up to statehood. They were pro-single statehood as opposed to twin statehood. And by 1921, it had sort of transitioned a little bit because of the domination of the Democratic Party. It was sort of nonpartisan on state and local stuff, but still Republican on national issues, and for the most part. The Tribune had started out even earlier than that as the Tulsa Democrat, and as you might guess from the name, it had always been a Democrat newspaper. The World and the Tribune had been very fierce enemies throughout their short existence together. And the Democrat at one time had been owned by Charles Page, who people around Tulsa may know of. But he sold the paper in 1920 to Richard Lloyd Jones, who was from Wisconsin. And Richard Lloyd Jones changed the name to the Tribune. So the Tribune was the afternoon paper. People today are not familiar with morning and afternoon papers.
I remember the Tribune.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
I remember the
So in those days, the afternoon papers tended to be the blue-collar paper. That was the working man's paper. They could read it when they got home from work. And it was, in this case, it was more activist, more crusading than the World. The World was more, morning papers in those days tended to be sort of the white-collar paper. They didn't really call it white-collar and blue-collar back then, but it was, so the World was kind of more the Chamber of Commerce types, and was not, it did not consider itself a crusading paper. It did engage in a couple of things. It was very instrumental in building the Spavinaw Water Project, which a lot of people today would think that doesn't seem like much, but it was a very big deal in the time. And Spavinaw is still our major source of water. And then a few years later, it got involved in kind of a war with the Ku Klux Klan. So, but it tended to not be as aggressive as the Tribune.
And the Tribune featured a lot of articles on illicit behavior. You use the word crusading. Illicit behavior in North Tulsa and in the Greenwood area, involving both blacks and whites. Why was that important at the time?
Well, to a certain extent, that seems to have sort of been the normal politics in Tulsa. The party out of if you've ever seen "Oh Brother, Where Art Thou," there was a lot of we got to get us some of that reform, you know. I mean, the party out of power was always talking about reform, and the party in power was trying to hold on to power. Right. And there were a lot of they had city elections every 2 years in those days. And they almost always switched every time. So one of the ways that the Tribune tried to build up support for reform, and there was a lot of crime in the city. I mean, a lot of vice, I guess we should say, was to highlight things that were going on in Greenwood, in North Tulsa. And that was kind of a low risk thing to do because
Right.
none of their readers were going to complain.
Right.
Right. Nobody was going to complain about that. And so what they were actually trying to do was attack. So the Tribune was mainly a Democratic paper. They were trying to attack the Republican administration at that time.
Okay. And so, like what happened in other parts of the country, those newspapers contributed to the climate and spreading information about allegations and so forth. And so that's the kind of the background for what happened.
Well, I think the big thing that they did was just reinforce stereotypes of the day, and they published a lot of stuff that was not necessarily inflammatory, but it was degrading, especially the Tribune. And as you pointed out, they were always trying to make it sound or even come right out and say, that this place is a cesspool of crime and we need to bulldoze it and all sorts of things like that. And was pretty unapologetic about it even after Greenwood burned to the ground. So I think that's there wasn't any of this. Let's go kill them all, or let's go. That wasn't going on. But what it was just reinforcing the attitudes and the stereotypes of the day, and in some cases amplifying on them,
and certainly creating that climate.
Yeah, sure, right. You're making these people less than human.
Right. So, what happened with Dick Rowland and Sarah Page? And you really spend some time talking about the two central figures and what happened on that fateful day at the Drexel Building. First of all, who was Dick Rowland and who was Sarah Page?
One of the real ironies of all of this is that those are two people we know very little about.
Exactly.
So Dick Rowland, the person we call Dick Rowland, was probably between 17 and 19 years old. Had probably lived in Tulsa most of his life and had some kind of a job that, sometimes he's described as a bootblack, sometimes he's described as a delivery boy. He might have been doing both. It's not really clear, but he had some kind of a job that had him in the 300 block of South Main all of the time. And Dick Rowland, there's a good chance Dick Rowland was not his name.
Right. I noticed that.
It's an interesting deal. I found a lot of.
He was adopted.
Well,
right,
in some cases he was described as the biological son of a man named Dave Rowland and his wife Alice, who had lived in Tulsa for quite a while. Dave apparently was a pretty well-known carpenter and handyman type guy, and he and his wife ran a boarding house on Archer. And in some cases he's described as Dick's grandfather. In some cases he's identified as, Dick is identified as Dave's adopted grandson, and sometimes he's identified as Dave's adopted son.
Okay.
So, and then there's also, anyway, so those are the main ways. In some places it's said that his real name is Jimmy Jones, and in the 1920 census there's a young man living with Dave and Alice who's about the right age who's identified as John Rowland. So
right.
We don't know if that's him or
contradictory.
Yeah. And so I don't know. I mean, I think maybe he was pretty well known as Dick Rowland just because nobody at the time seemed to question that identification of him. There was no Dick Rowland, aka John Rowland, and I should point out that at that time people often changed their names.
Okay.
And so that would not have been unusual. And Sarah Page we know even less about. According to the sheriff, So the story that was written, the one that
appeared in the Tribune,
that
Right.
was described as the story that set Tulsa ablaze.
Mm-hmm.
She was described as a 17-year-old orphan girl working her way through business college.
Right.
But the sheriff said that it was his information that she was a 15-year-old divorcee who was waiting in Tulsa for her divorce to become final.
Mm-hmm.
And in any event, she left town on June 1st, apparently.
Mm-hmm.
And there's
We know
no
anymore
sign
about
of her after
Right.
that. And Dick Rowland stayed in town. I'm not really clear if he was in jail the whole time or if he was out on bail for a while. But anyway, he was in Tulsa until September. And then the charges against him were dropped. And he dropped out of sight pretty quickly after that.
Right. Why were they both in the Drexel building on May the 30th?
Well, so it's not entirely clear why he was in the Drexel building. She was the elevator operator. And the building apparently was mainly empty. This was on May 30th. It was Memorial Day, which was a very big holiday right after World War I. And there'd been a big parade downtown and all this stuff. So there weren't very many people
in that building on that day.
Yeah, right. So I think there's two or three possible explanations. One, so some people said that he went there to use the restroom, and that may be true. I don't know. If he was a delivery boy, or even if he was a shoe shiner, he may have been making a delivery. You know, he might have been taking shoes up to somebody's office, or some other delivery up to the office. Or the third possibility is that he went there to see her. You know, the part of the lore that's grown up around this
That they were romantically
involved.
Yeah.
And that seems that's first recorded in the early 1970s,
Right.
which doesn't mean it hadn't been around all that time.
By a relative of
Yeah.
Rowland's,
Yeah.
correct? Okay.
Yeah, she seems to have been a relative. She said she was his adopted mother. I checked out some of the other stuff she said, and I think she was quite elderly by this time.
Okay, sure. Yeah.
And so some of the stuff doesn't quite, the time sequences are off and everything. So I think she was connected to him, and she might have been his adopted mother. I think she probably knew him. I can't show that she was in Tulsa at the time this happened.
But something happened on that elevator.
Something happened on that elevator.
According to the eyewitness, or not the eyewitness, but the person who
heard those two,
commotion.
those two, Sarah Page and Dick Rowland are the only ones who ever really knew for sure what happened. They were on the elevator.
Right.
She screamed. When the elevator got to the ground floor, he left the elevator running.
Right.
There was Rinberg's apartment store was in that building. There was a person working there, even though the store was closed, and they called the police. She said that he attacked her or tried to assault her, but then she kind of backed off of that story later on. The chief of detectives said that they were probably not going to. Dick Rowland was arrested the next morning, the morning of May 31st, which is when the Tribune story appeared. It did not appear the day that the incident happened. It appeared after his arrest the following day. And so the chief of detectives told the world that they didn't think there was much going to come of it, and they would probably have released him if the Tribune story hadn't come out.
So you refer to the Tribune story, the headline about Negro assaulting.
Two nab Negro for attack on girl in elevator.
Right. So that story really helped incite the
Well, it's certainly,
concern.
and it's hard, but it's hard to say. So the one thing that we know that it probably did, or the most likely thing that it did, was that it caused someone to call the police commissioner.
Right.
Tulsa had a commission form of government in those days. It was a little different now. So you had And if you've lived in Tulsa long enough, you might remember when we still had it, but you had a police commissioner and a street commissioner, and all these people there were 4 of them, and they were elected at large citywide, and they looked over a specific area of government. Mm-hmm. So somebody called the police commissioner and said, we're going to get that guy.
Right. Going to lynch him. Did they use the word lynch?
Well,
tonight or soon or
yeah, it's kind of hard to. I can't remember the exact language that was given for the phone call. Now afterwards, and this is where some of the conflation I think comes in. Both the World and the Tribune said the word went around that the Negro was to be lynched.
Right, and that became the basis for the belief that you spend some time addressing that there was an editorial that said Roland was going to be lynched, and you seem to conclude that the editorial did not appear and wasn't the foundation for the rumor. The phone call, the anonymous phone call, was the basis for the rumor. Is that right?
Well, I think it's so. In most of this stuff, I guess I'm being wishy-washy, but I think about more in terms of probabilities because I can't say for certain.
Right.
But I think it's unlikely that any such.
That there was an editorial.
I think it's unlikely there was an editorial. I think the story played a big role, in part because of the reaction of the Black Dispatch in Oklahoma City. But at any event, this call to the police commissioner caused them to move Roland from the city jail, which was very vulnerable. I think it may have been an old horse stable. I thought I'd read that somewhere, and then I never could find it again. But there are pictures of it, and it's like a low slung building. And they moved him to the county jail, which was on top of the courthouse at 6th and Boulder, and much more defensible. And in doing so, they turned him over to the county sheriff, who seems to have been more. He was more committed to keeping anybody from getting at Dick Roland than perhaps the police chief would have been. But at any rate, all of that started building. And one of the things that seems to have played a big role in this were the telephones. I mean, the officials at the time said telephones were important. And then the telephone officials said that they had, I don't remember off the top of my head, but I want to say it was 3 times the normal telephone traffic that day.
Yes.
Of people calling.
So that's how the word spread.
Word spread around, and
he was there.
Yeah. Okay. Something may happen.
Something's going to happen to him.
Something may happen at the courthouse, and you got to keep in mind, there's no news helicopters, there's no television, there's no radio. If you want to see what's happening, you got to go.
And so, thousands. What I think you say 2,000 approximately, 2,000 whites and about 300 blacks gathered at the.
It's really hard because the estimates are all over, and it seemed to be growing pretty steadily. And one thing that's different now than then. It's interesting because now we're kind of worried about the militarization of the police, and I think that is a concern. But it was the opposite problem in those days. They didn't have enough of them. They weren't properly armed. They weren't properly trained. And so, nowadays, if there'd be some kind of a threat like that, you'd have all sorts of armed, heavily armed law enforcement, National Guard, all sorts of people out there.
Right.
Well, in this case, it was the white sheriff and his black deputy out on the courthouse steps trying to get, hundreds or thousands of people to go home.
In an effort to, so you say that around 10:30 on the 31st, you have these groups gathered there at the courthouse. And there might have been an effort to disarm one of the black men there. And that was the beginning, or could have been, the beginning of the conflict, an effort to take a pistol from one of the black men there. So the black men went to the courthouse
Right.
to protect Roland.
Correct.
And presumably the white men were there to get him and lynch him.
Well, I think it's very hard to tell. I think a lot of the people at the courthouse were there to see what happens.
Okay. Right,
Because
sure. Human nature.
I don't know that any of them would have stepped in to try and keep him from
yeah.
being lynched.
Right.
But the only story we have of actually trying to get at Dick Rowland were three men coming into the courthouse, and the sheriff, McCullough, and one of the county commissioners met them on the first floor. Dick Rowland was on the fifth floor. They met him at the door and said, "Turn around and leave or we'll shoot you where you stand."
Okay.
And they left. Now, would they have come back with more people to try and... It would have been difficult to get Dick Rowland out of there without the cooperation of the authorities. And when there was a lynching the previous year, that's what happened. They took the sheriff hostage, which led to a guy named Belton, Roy Belton, being lynched. Well, this time, the sheriff and all these deputies went up to the top floor and disabled the elevator. And so the only way to get up there was through this narrow stairwell. So it's funny, I actually found the entry in the county records where they'd paid the elevator company to come back and fix the elevator.
Oh, wow.
But anyway, that's sort of a pointless aside. But
so that evening of the night of the 31st, they're gathered there, and they try to take the weapon from one of the men there, and there was a scuffle.
Yeah, and actually what had happened is the law enforcement people, the police chief was there, and the police commissioner, and they were kind of moving through the crowd, and there were some other civilians trying to get people to go home, but the decision had been made that it was too dangerous to try and disarm people because that would probably start, one of them would probably go off. And there was a man named McQueen who had been an unsuccessful candidate for sheriff in 1920, and so just the previous November. And you don't know, but it's easy to suppose that he decided he was going to show he should be sheriff here, and he moved in and tried to take a gun away from one of the black men, and it went off.
Okay.
And when the gun went off, then it was just all bets. But sort of what was going on here, and I know some people think that the black men did this intentionally. Whatever anger there was directed towards Dick Rowland began to be directed towards these black men. Yeah, how dare you come into White Tulsa with these guns and in such large numbers.
And many of the men, I'm assuming, were veterans of the First World War. And
yeah, it's hard to say, but some of them were. No, there seems
knew how to acquit themselves with the weapon, and
and I think
there's so many parallels.
Yeah.
If we could zoom out, between what happened here and what happened during what was called the Red Summer, because you have this inflammatory newspaper article alleging some type of assault by a black man on a white woman. If you look at other incidents of racial violence, Omaha, Nebraska, and other cities,
right.
So many parallels between Tulsa and those episodes.
And again, I think it comes down to power.
Yeah.
There's this group of people who are used to having absolute or almost absolute power over everything, but especially this other group of people, and this other group of people are saying, "Hey, we want our share too." So, I think it was, like I said, all of them have their unique features. But at the root, a lot of them are still about, one group of people wanting change and the other group wanting things to stay the way they were or are.
And the important role of the local newspapers,
Yeah.
as you point out in your book.
Yeah, like again, the newspapers did a in some ways the newspapers did a pretty good job of reporting, given their size and the kind of staffs they had at that time and all of that. But they also didn't, they also were completely oblivious to any kind of, I don't know what you would say, racial sensitivity or any. I mean, they wouldn't even know what to make of a phrase like racial sensitivity. But it's like only the white point of view matters. What we don't even really care what the black people think. We just this is our. There may be some disagreement among whites, but it's like this much disagreement. And so I think that that was reinforced, before, during, and after all of this stuff.
Sure. And so the massacre took place where exactly? Where was this area known as Greenwood?
Yeah.
And how large was it?
Well, it was pretty large. I mean, there were probably, I've seen different estimates, but it was probably 6,000 or 7,000 people. And so it began on the north side of the Frisco tracks, and it ran from mostly from Detroit over to a couple of blocks east of Greenwood, where the old steel plant is on the hill there now. That would have been kind of the boundary line there, and now right along the railroad tracks, it actually went all the way over to Boston.
Okay.
And then it came back, and then it went up Detroit. So Detroit Avenue, the east side of Detroit Avenue, was kind of that's where most of the better homes were, and then the rest of it was kind of a hodgepodge of some pretty nice middle-class homes, some not-so-nice homes, some places that frankly were not very nice at all. And it went all the way up Greenwood, it's pretty much to where Pine is now. There may have been a few houses already above Pine.
Okay. And so what happened? How was that, when you think about the size of that area, how was that entire area left in ruins by June the 1st?
Yeah, and I think that's probably one of the best arguments that this was some kind of a planned, maybe not planned well in advance, but planned overnight on May 31st, June 1st. The officials said they counted at least 25 separate fires started. So this was a widespread, went out and
certainly seemed to be coordinated.
Yeah,
Some level of coordination.
Yeah, at least it was more than just a sort of a random
acts of violence,
or some kind of. One person at one point tried to argue that it was started by a train going through, cinders from a train, but that's not that's not what happened. And all of the in the various recorded stories from right at that time and the court testimonies and some of the documents we have and all, they all describe scenes where men, in some cases identified as law enforcement officers, not in uniform, but they were recognized as law officers, going in, and they either had some kind of they all had a torch. In some cases, they just lit it with a torch. In some cases, they poured some kind of accelerant, like coal oil or something like that on it, and lit these fires. And it's very, there was a law officer named Bostic, a black man, who told about, going to his house, and the people, these white men, and one of them he recognized as a traffic officer, is piling up his furniture, and they watch him set his own house on fire. Wow. They put him and his wife in a car and drive him away.
Wow.
Kind of the same thing with Barney Cleaver. They went up to O.W. Gurley, Yeah, some men did and said, have you got all your guests out of your hotel? And he said, no. And they said, well, you better get them out of there. We're going to burn it down.
Mm-hmm.
And that's so. I think destruction. This might be controversial for some people, but I think destruction was the primary goal here, more than murder, more than killing. They wanted to destroy the place. They wanted to prove. I think this was to make a point, and the point was
the point about black advancement.
Yes,
know your place.
That's exactly right. I think they wanted to say, look, we know you guys have been getting awfully independent, and you think you've built this up, and you think you're doing awfully well, but we can take it away from you like that, and that's what they did.
Certainly happened in other communities.
Yes, that often happened.
Black people were perceived to be moving too fast, gaining too much.
Yeah, well, but I think the last straw was these men going to the courthouse
sure.
because that was just too far outside the boundaries. And I think I haven't made an academic study of this, but from reading, it seems to me like this was a common thing. If one of these mobs or whatever could not get at the individual they were angry with, then they took it out on the community.
Right. Yeah.
If the community put up any resistance, then we take it. You can either surrender, this one guy,
or we'll destroy your entire community.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Recently, as you know, there's been a lot of focus on mass graves based on eyewitness accounts from the incident. Did you come across any evidence of that, and what are your thoughts on? Do you think they'll be successful at locating the graves?
Well, the job they have before them is very, very difficult, and so I think people should not. You can be disappointed if they don't find anything, but I wouldn't take it as the final word.
Okay.
And I'm just saying that because there's a lot of places. There are a lot of places to look. We still get calls all the time from people who want to tell us where they're and they probably can't be everywhere that people swear they're they know where they are. So I think this is the backstory, or what leads us up to thinking that there are these either, and I would expand it, not just say that there may be mass graves, or there may be people buried in individual graves in unknown places, because that's part of the stories too. Is that they hired a bunch of grave diggers who went out and dug individual graves, or they could be like, 5 people here and 4 people there and 10 people that we just you don't know, and so. I keep a very open mind on that. I just don't know. But where that originated was that the officials themselves at the time, this is one of the stories that is as old as the massacre.
Right.
The officials at the time said, we don't know how many people were killed. We're not sure this is all of them. At one time they were estimating 100, or there's a Tulsa World headline, 100 dead. Somebody else estimated 175. And then the next day they said, well, we can only find 27, as it turns out. And so that number has since grown to 37.
There seems to be some consensus that it was a little bit higher than 300, between 300 and 400.
Well, some people say that. I just don't know. I like I said, I just the more I look at it, the harder it is, and I go back and forth. And all I would say is it's almost certainly more than 37.
Right.
And more than that, I don't know, because there's all these intangibles, and an awful lot of things that we just don't know, and so. If they're now, I think they're going to look at this part of Oaklawn Cemetery, where they think that maybe there were 18 African Americans buried in Oaklawn that we know of. And so I think they're going to try and look at that and see if they can, maybe get some information there. That's not going to add to the number, but it may give us some information as to how the bodies were treated, and it may actually, some people may be able to, they may be able to do some DNA stuff where they can actually identify certain sets of remains. But if people were really determined to hide a bunch of bodies,
It's becoming difficult to locate.
it's going to be really hard, especially if we're talking about 300. I mean,
Right.
that's going to be hard to find, and like 25 or 50. For instance, I would not have been at all surprised if they'd found some in the first place that they looked. I didn't think they'd find 300 probably, but I
Right.
thought it would not have been unreasonable that they would have found, 25 or, some number, because that was probably a number that you could perhaps get buried without anybody noticing. But if you got 300 bodies and you're trying to bury them somewhere without anybody noticing, that's pretty hard to do.
Right. We have some very bright students here at the college, and some of them have submitted questions for me to ask you, and so I want to ask a couple of those questions. What was the most challenging part about writing this book? What challenged you the most?
So I would say the most challenging thing for me was to learn to be not quite so much of a older white man, and sort of keep my understand a whole bunch of different perspectives, because just in general, that's been something that I've learned through all of this. And I can't. Nobody can change who they are, but you can learn to understand other perspectives and where they're coming from. And so I thought I knew something about, race and racism and the history of race in this country and all that stuff before I started working on this in the 90s, in the late 90s. And I pretty quickly figured out I really didn't know anything. I'd led a pretty, even though I'd been a sports writer and all kinds of stuff, I'd really led a pretty isolated life. And I think there are a lot of, white people in Oklahoma and in Tulsa and maybe in America who are in the same boat. They think they know, but they don't really understand.
Okay. And sort of continuing on with that line of thought, what do you want to accomplish with this book? What do you want readers to learn and take away from?
Well, when I first started working on it, I was thinking about it mainly in terms of something to have internally at the World. So when I was not there anymore, and people needed to, know something about the massacre, that would be there, and it'd have a lot of citations in it, and they could go look the citations up. So originally it was just intended to kind of be a very basic history or telling of what happened. But with the book, and as time went along, really a lot of the stuff that happened was, I want people to understand what happened and why it happened, and because I was writing for the newspaper, for the Tulsa World, I came to feel like I was really often writing for an audience that didn't really want to hear what I had to say. And so, because that audience was predominantly white, and for most of my time in Tulsa, which has been since 1979, if a white Tulsan didn't want to have to deal with race, they really didn't have to. They can just ignore it for most people. So I was trying to find a way to engage people who might not otherwise be interested in this topic. I was not. I decided it was not my job to sing or to preach to the choir. You know, I mean, and I don't want to make that sound like evangelical or anything like that, because I don't think I ever, got on a soapbox or anything about it. But I just wanted to lay the information as I had it out there, and hope people would read it and say, oh, okay, so now I understand why these people that I've never really talked to feel the way they do.
Right. Sure. Yeah.
Yeah, and then I also wanted to get, just sort of in the record some of the basic information that I had found, but I also wanted those citations and things like that so that people could go look for themselves, and if they wanted to, and decide for themselves on some of this stuff. And I know not many people are going to want to do that, but if somebody wants to, it's there.
Sure. Well, our country is going through a period of racial reckoning right now.
Right.
And so, as a journalist, what do you think the role of journalism and responsibility of journalism is in that process of covering events and tragedies and horrific acts of violence that are part of our society today?
Yeah. I think at its very basic level, journalism. So I fell for the line about journalism being the first rough draft of history when I went to college, and that's, I guess, what it attracted to me. And I think so. Journalism to me is telling people what's going on today, and there are a lot of ways to do that, and there's probably more ways to do that now than there ever have been. We've got all sorts of different kinds of media in terms of internet and video. We still have print, and so but then we have all these outlets too. When I was growing up,
you'd have to compete with Facebook.
Yeah, when I was growing up, we basically had 3 television networks and PBS that hardly anybody watched, and the newspaper. So and now the choices are almost endless. I mean, and each one of them is looking for their own audience. So I think the role of journalism is to honestly tell people what's going on today, and that's going to come from a lot of different perspectives, and it may not always look the same. I mean, if you read The World and the Tribune in their early days, they would cover the same event, and you couldn't even tell that they'd been the same place sometimes, because they'd give 2 completely different views of it. And we get the same thing today with a lot of the political stuff. But I would say the thing that concerns me the most is that we get so focused on the top tier, like who's the president, who's in the Supreme Court, who's a senator. All those things are important, but it's also really important what's going on at your community level. What's going on between you and the other people around you. What's going on between you and your students? What's going on among them individually? Right. And that needs to be chronicled too. And I don't think it's a lot harder to do that these days, oddly enough. So, we've got a lot of people covering Washington. We don't have nearly as many people covering school boards, and I mean, school boards are probably the most important elected bodies in America, and hardly anybody ever pays any attention to them until something goes wrong.
Right.
School elections are probably the most important elections that anybody can vote in, but nobody ever votes in them.
Well, you certainly do an outstanding job of telling us what Tulsa was like in 1921 and contributing to our understanding of this horrific incident of racial violence, the worst in American history. So thank you
Thank you for asking me.
Thank you for writing this book, and thank you for your time today.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Thank you.